Broke student donates textbooks to village school, never knowing he inspired a future Nobel Prize winner. The words floated through Michael Chen's mind as he stared at the final balance in his bank account. $12.47. Not enough for next month's rent, certainly not enough for next semester's textbooks. He sat on the edge of his threadbare mattress, the weight of his decision pressing down on his shoulders, along with the fatigue of working 2 jobs while maintaining a full course load. The small apartment creaked around him, a symphony of poverty that had become all too familiar over the past 3 years. Outside, rain pelted against the single window, creating rivulets that distorted the city lights beyond. Michael ran his fingers along the spines of his biochemistry textbooks, the ones he'd saved for months to buy, the ones that represented countless sleepless nights highlighted by the blue glow of his desk lamp. "It's just stuff," he whispered to himself, though the tremor in his voice betrayed him. These weren't just textbooks. They were his lifeline to a future beyond this apartment, beyond the endless cycle of minimum wage jobs and instant noodle dinners. His phone buzzed with a notification. Another email from the university's financial aid office. Another rejection. His scholarship had been cut by 30% due to budget constraints. The words blurred as tears threatened to spill, but Michael blinked them back, his jaw clenching with the determination that had gotten him this far. 3 years ago, his mother had died after a prolonged battle with cancer, leaving nothing but medical debts and memories. His father had disappeared long before that, a shadow in family photographs but never present for birthdays or graduations. Michael was alone, had been alone since he was 19, carrying the weight of his mother's last words. "Make something beautiful of your life, Mikey. Something that matters." The rain intensified, drumming against the window like impatient fingers. Michael opened his laptop, the hinges protesting with a familiar squeak. He navigated to his email and clicked on the message from Dr. Abernathy, his biochemistry professor. "I'm still looking for donations for the Books Beyond Borders program. Any gently used textbooks would be greatly appreciated. They're being sent to a small village school in rural Ethiopia where educational resources are scarce." Michael's gaze drifted back to his collection of textbooks, the margins filled with his careful notes, the pages dog-eared at important passages. They represented thousands of dollars, money he desperately needed if he was going to continue his education. But they also represented possibility, something that matters. With hands that only slightly trembled, Michael began to pack his textbooks into a cardboard box. The biochemistry textbook, the organic chemistry lab manual, the molecular biology reference guide, all of them, save for the one he needed for his current course. As he placed each book into the box, he felt a curious mixture of loss and liberation, a letting go that somehow felt like moving forward. That night, he slept better than he had in months. 5,000 miles away, in the small village of Abaned, Ethiopia, 11-year-old Desta Haila walked barefoot along the dusty road that led to her school. The morning sun had barely crested the horizon, casting long shadows across the parched earth. Despite the early hours, sweat already beaded on her forehead, dampening the collar of her faded blue uniform. Her stomach growled, a hollow sound that echoed the emptiness inside. She hadn't eaten since yesterday's lunch. A small portion of injera with wat that hadn't been enough to satisfy her hunger then, let alone sustain her through the night. But hunger was a familiar companion, one she had learned to ignore in favor of more pressing matters, like education. Desta clutched her notebook to her chest, its pages filled with her careful, precise handwriting. Unlike some of her classmates, she treasured every opportunity to learn, every piece of knowledge offered. Her father had died when she was 5, leaving her mother to raise 4 children alone. The older siblings had already abandoned school to work in the fields or seek employment in the city. But Desta's mother had insisted that her youngest child continue her education. "Knowledge is the only thing no one can take from you," her mother would say, smoothing Desta's tightly braided hair with calloused hands. "It is the key that opens doors." The school appeared on the horizon, a simple concrete structure with a corrugated metal roof that amplified the sound of rain during the wet season. Today it stood silent under the brightening sky, windows open to catch any breeze that might offer relief from the impending heat. Mr. Tades, the headmaster, stood at the entrance, his tall frame silhouetted against the whitewashed wall. When he spotted Desta, he waved her over with unusual excitement. "Desta, come quickly. Something wonderful has happened." She approached cautiously, curiosity quickening her steps despite her fatigue. "Look, Mr. Tadessa said, gesturing to several large boxes stacked against the wall of his small office. "Books from America. A university in California has sent us textbooks through a program called Books Beyond Borders. Desta peered into the nearest box, her eyes widening at the sight of colorful, thick textbooks with glossy pages and complex diagrams. She had never seen books like these. Her school had only a handful of tattered textbooks that students shared, passing them between classes and taking turns to read chapters for homework. "May I?" she asked, her fingers hovering above a heavy volume with a double helix depicted on its cover. "Mr." Tadesse nodded, his smile crinkling the corners of his eyes. "These are university-level textbooks. Very advanced. But I know how you love science, Desta. Perhaps you would like to keep this one in the reading corner? You can look at it during lunch breaks." The book was heavier than she expected, requiring both hands to lift it. Introduction to Biochemistry. She read slowly, tracing the English words with her finger. The pages fell open to reveal handwritten notes in the margins. Neat, precise handwriting in blue ink. Diagrams were underlined, key concepts circled, and in some places small drawings illustrated complex processes. "Someone studied from this book before," she said, wonder coloring her voice. "Yes, Mr." Tadesse replied. "A student from America. See here." He pointed to a name written inside the front cover. Michael Chen. Desta touched the name reverently, feeling a connection to this unknown person who had once held the same book, who had pondered the same diagrams and concepts. She imagined him sitting at a desk in a grand university, surrounded by lights and computers and unlimited knowledge. "Thank you, Michael Chen," she whispered, too softly for Mr. Tadesse to hear. That afternoon, instead of playing with the other children during the lunch break, Desta sat in the shade of the acacia tree behind the school, the biochemistry textbook open on her lap. Most of the content was far beyond her understanding, the specialized vocabulary like a foreign language. But the handwritten notes offered glimpses of clarity, little windows into this complex world. One note in particular caught her attention. Next to a diagram of a cell, Michael had written, "Everything alive, from the smallest bacteria to the largest whale, operates on these same fundamental principles. Life is one language spoken with infinite dialects." Desta read this note over and over, feeling something stir within her, a sense of connection, of possibility, of worlds beyond her small village. That night, as she lay on her thin mattress in the one-room house she shared with her mother and siblings, she whispered Michael's words to herself until sleep finally claimed her. She dreamed of cells and molecules dancing beneath an endless sky. Current 7 years passed. Michael stood in the sterile hallway of Boston Memorial Hospital, his white coat pressed and name badge, Michael Chen, MD, resident physician, prominently displayed. Behind him, the door to room 412 remained closed, his hand still resting on the handle. Inside was a 7-year-old boy named Eli, diagnosed with acute lymphoblastic leukemia 3 months ago. His prognosis was good. Remission rates for children were high with current treatment protocols. But explaining the necessary procedures to a frightened child and his equally frightened parents had left Michael emotionally drained. "Tough one?" Dr. Kavita Sharma, his attending physician, approached with 2 cups of coffee in hand. She offered one to Michael, who accepted it gratefully. "Not medically," he replied, taking a sip and grimacing at the bitter taste. "Hospital coffee was universally terrible. He reminds me of someone." "Doctor." Sharma nodded, understanding in her dark eyes. "In pediatric oncology, they all remind us of someone. That's what makes this job both the hardest and the most rewarding." Michael's pager buzzed. Another patient needed attention. He finished his coffee in 2 quick gulps, tossed the cup into a nearby recycling bin, and headed toward the elevators. As he waited, he caught his reflection in the polished metal doors. 30 years old now, with faint lines beginning at the corners of his eyes and the first strands of gray appearing at his temples. Medical school and residency had aged him, but not in ways he regretted. He thought, as he often did during quiet moments, of the textbooks he donated all those years ago. It had been a pivotal moment, though he hadn't recognized it at the time. That single act, giving away books he could scarcely afford to part with, had shifted something fundamental within him. The following semester, he changed his major from pre-med to biochemical research, determined to develop more accessible treatments for diseases like the one that had taken his mother. But fate had other plans. During his senior year, a guest lecture by a renowned oncologist had rekindled his interest in direct patient care. "We need researchers," the doctor had said, "but we also need healers who understand the science." Michael had applied to medical school the following day. Now, as he stepped into the elevator and pressed the button for the 4th floor, He wondered where those textbooks had ended up. Had they been useful? Had they mattered? Sometimes during the darkest hours of his residency, when exhaustion threatened to overwhelm his dedication, he comforted himself with the thought that somewhere, someone might be learning from those books, building a future on the knowledge he had passed along. It was a small comfort, but on days like today, it was enough. Desta Haile stood at the podium, the weight of the Nobel medal heavy against her chest. At 28, she was among the youngest recipients of the Nobel Prize in Chemistry, recognized for her groundbreaking work on enzyme catalysis that had revolutionized drug development for tropical diseases. The grand hall of the Stockholm Concert House stretched before her, filled with distinguished scientists, royalty, and diplomats. The bright lights made it difficult to see individual faces in the audience, but Desta knew her mother was there, seated in the front row, wearing her finest traditional Ethiopian dress. It had been a long journey from their village to this moment, a journey made possible by a series of scholarships, mentors, and opportunities that seemed miraculous in retrospect. And it had all begun with a textbook. "I stand before you today," Desta began, her voice steady despite the emotion threatening to overwhelm her, "as evidence of how knowledge, once shared, can transcend boundaries and transform lives." She paused, her fingers lightly touching the metal. "When I was 11 years old, a biochemistry textbook arrived at my village school in Ethiopia. It was donated by an American student named Michael Chen, who could not possibly have known what his generosity would spark. In the margins of that textbook, I found not only knowledge but also evidence of a curious, compassionate mind. His notes became my first lessons in scientific thinking, guiding me through concepts that would otherwise have remained inaccessible." The audience was utterly silent, captivated by the story of connection across continents. "For years, I have wanted to thank Michael Chen," Desta continued. "I have carried his name with me through primary school in Ethiopia, through secondary school in Addis Ababa, through undergraduate studies at Oxford, and through my doctoral research at MIT. His single act of generosity, donating a textbook he likely needed himself, set in motion a chain of events that led directly to the discoveries we celebrate today." She reached beneath the podium and produced a book, worn, its cover faded, but unmistakably the same biochemistry textbook that had changed her life 17 years earlier. "I still have it," she said, holding it up for the audience to see. "And I still read Michael's notes when I need inspiration or courage. One note in particular has guided my work. Everything alive operates on these same fundamental principles. Life is one language spoken with infinite dialects. This insight informed my approach to enzyme catalysis across diverse biological systems and ultimately led to the development of treatments for diseases that affect millions of people in developing nations." Desta took a deep breath, emotion finally breaking through her composed exterior. "I do not know what became of Michael Chen. I have searched for him without success, but I want him to know that his kindness mattered. That knowledge shared is never wasted. That a single act of generosity can ripple across time and space to create change we could never imagine." Tears glistened in her eyes, catching the light. "This medal belongs as much to him as it does to me." In a small apartment in Boston, Michael sat cross-legged on his sofa, a bowl of reheated pasta balanced on his knee, watching the Nobel Prize ceremony live stream on his laptop. He had just completed a 36-hour shift at the hospital and had intended to collapse into bed immediately upon returning home. But a colleague had texted him about the youngest ever Nobel chemistry laureate from Ethiopia, suggesting her work might have applications for some of their pediatric oncology patients. Too exhausted to sleep, a familiar paradox of residency, Michael had decided to watch the ceremony instead. He was half listening to the introductions when the name Desta Haile caught his attention. Something about it tugged at his memory, though he couldn't place why. When the young woman approached the podium, Michael was struck by her poise, her quiet confidence. She couldn't be more than 30, yet she carried herself with the dignity of someone who had overcome significant obstacles. He took a bite of pasta, his attention now fully captured. And then she mentioned his name. The fork clattered against the bowl as it slipped from his suddenly numb fingers. Michael Chen. She was talking about him, about a textbook he had donated, the biochemistry textbook with his notes in the margins. The one he had packed into a cardboard box on a rainy night so many years ago, when his bank account held $12.47 and his future seemed impossibly distant. "I do not know what became of Michael Chen," Desta was saying on the screen. "I have searched for him without success, But I want him to know that his kindness mattered. Michael's vision blurred, tears welling up and spilling onto his cheeks. He hadn't cried since his mother's funeral, had built walls around his emotions to survive the daily tragedies of oncology. But now those walls crumbled in an instant, swept away by the revelation that a moment he had almost forgotten had shaped someone else's entire life. His hands shaking, he reached for his phone and opened his email. He began to type a message to the Nobel Committee, then stopped, overwhelmed by the implications. What would he say? How could he possibly explain what he was feeling in this moment? Instead, he searched for Desta Hiley's research, finding her publications, her faculty page at MIT, her TED talk on enzyme catalysis and global health equity. He read until dawn painted the sky outside his window, absorbing the brilliant work of this woman who had carried his words with her all these years. As sunlight streamed into his apartment, Michael made a decision. He would reach out to her, not because he wanted recognition or gratitude, but because their connection felt important somehow, a testament to how lives could intersect in meaningful ways despite distance and circumstance. He found her professional email on the MIT website and composed a simple message. Dr. Hiley, I watched your Nobel acceptance speech last night. I am the Michael Chen whose textbook found its way to your village school. I wanted you to know that while you were finding inspiration in my margin notes, I was struggling through medical school, often questioning my path. Learning that those books, that my small act of letting go, somehow mattered in the world, gives me more joy than I can express. I am now a pediatric oncology resident in Boston. Perhaps if you are willing, we could meet someday. I would very much like to hear your story in person. With profound respect and gratitude, Michael Chen, MD. He sent the email before doubt could cloud his resolve, then finally collapsed into bed, sleep claiming him instantly. For the first time in years, his dreams were not haunted by the patients he couldn't save, but instead filled with images of a small village school where a girl opened a textbook and found a future inside. The cafe on Massachusetts Avenue buzzed with the typical Cambridge energy. Students hunched over laptops, professors grading papers, tourists consulting maps of Harvard Square. Desta sat at a corner table, her fingers tapping a nervous rhythm on the battered biochemistry textbook she had placed before her. She checked her watch. 5 minutes until their agreed meeting time. Her heart raced with an anxiety that seemed disproportionate to the occasion. After all, she had stood before kings and presidents without this flutter in her chest. But this was different. This was Michael Chen. After receiving his email, they had exchanged several messages, tentatively at first, then with increasing warmth, as they discovered shared interest beyond their unexpected connection. He had apologized for not being able to meet immediately, the demands of residency leaving him with precious little free time, but had suggested this cafe near MIT once his schedule allowed. Desta sipped her coffee, grimacing slightly at the bitterness. Despite 7 years in America, she still preferred the ceremony of Ethiopian coffee, the rich aroma and unhurried pace that accompanied it. Her phone buzzed with a text from her lab assistant about an experimental protocol, but she ignored it. Today was not about work. The door opened, letting in a gust of autumn air along with a man in a gray pea coat. He paused, scanning the cafe, and Desta knew immediately it was him. Michael Chen, older than in the graduation photo she had found online, with strands of gray at his temples and fatigue evident in the set of his shoulders. But his eyes, they were exactly as she had imagined them all these years. Kind, intelligent, searching. Their gazes met across the crowded space. A moment of recognition passed between them. A current of connection so strong Desta felt it as a physical sensation. She stood, raising her hand in a small wave. He made his way through the maze of tables, his expression shifting from nervousness to wonder. Dr. Haley, he said when he reached her, his voice soft with emotion. Desta, please, she replied, extending her hand. He took it, but instead of a formal handshake, he simply held it for a moment as though confirming she was real. Michael, he offered in return. They sat across from each other, an awkward silence falling between them. What do you say to someone whose life has been intertwined with yours in such an extraordinary way? Where do you begin? Michael broke the silence first. I brought you something, he said, reaching into his messenger bag. He withdrew a small package wrapped in brown paper and placed it on the table between them. It's not a Nobel Prize, but I thought you might appreciate it. Desta unwrapped the package carefully to reveal a composition notebook, its cover decorated with molecular diagrams drawn in colored pen. She opened it to find pages filled with the same neat handwriting she had studied so intently as a child. "My research notes from undergraduate biochemistry," Michael explained. "I kept all my notebooks, even after I switched to medical school. I thought you might like to have this one, since the textbook meant something to you." Emotion welled up in Desta's throat, making speech momentarily impossible. She traced a finger over a diagram of the citric acid cycle, remembering how she had struggled to understand this process with only Michael's margin notes as a guide. "Thank you," she managed finally. "This means more than I can express." She slid the biochemistry textbook across the table to him. "And I brought this. It belongs to you, after all." Michael made no move to take it. "No," he said gently. "It found exactly where it was meant to be." Their eyes met again, and Desta saw in his gaze a reflection of her own journey. The struggles, the determination, the moments of doubt and triumph. Though their paths had been different, they shared a fundamental understanding of what it meant to pursue knowledge against significant odds. "Tell me," Michael said, leaning forward slightly, "how did you go from a village school in Ethiopia to MIT and a Nobel Prize?" "I want to hear everything." So Desta told him. About walking miles to school each day, about Mr. Tedeschi recognizing her potential and securing a scholarship to a secondary school in Addis Ababa, about the international science competition she won at 16 that brought her to the attention of university recruiters. She told him about the culture shock of Oxford, the loneliness of being the only Ethiopian student in her program, the determination that kept her going when homesickness threatened to overwhelm her. And Michael listened, really listened, asking questions that revealed his genuine interest in her journey. When she finished, he shared his own story, the loss of his mother, the financial struggles through college, the moment of decision when he donated his textbooks, his path through medical research, and eventually to pediatric oncology. "It's strange," he said as afternoon faded toward evening, their coffee cups long empty. "In some ways, we've been on parallel journeys without knowing it, both of us working to fight diseases that affect the most vulnerable." Desta nodded, struck by the truth of his observation. "Different approaches to the same problem. The enzyme catalysis method you developed," Michael hesitated, a new energy entering his voice. "I've been reading about its applications. There's potential there for targeted chemotherapy with fewer side effects. I've been thinking about a particular patient population that might benefit." Without planning to, they shifted into a discussion of potential clinical applications for Desta's research. She found herself drawing diagrams on napkins, explaining the specifics of enzyme behavior that Michael's medical training hadn't covered. He countered with insights from his clinical experience, identifying challenges her laboratory work hadn't anticipated. "We should collaborate," Desta said suddenly, the idea crystallizing as she spoke it. "Your clinical knowledge and my biochemical approach, together we might develop something truly innovative." Michael's smile spread slowly across his face. From a donated textbook to a research partnership. "Who would have imagined?" "I've learned that knowledge has its own momentum," Desta replied. "Once set in motion, it finds unexpected paths." As they finally prepared to leave the cafe, the sky outside dark and star-filled, Michael paused, his expression growing serious. "I need to thank you," he said. Desta shook her head, confused. "Thank me? I'm the one who should be thanking you. Your textbook changed my life, and learning about that changed mine," he replied. "I've been struggling lately. The demands of residency, the emotional toll of working with sick children, questioning whether I'm making a difference. And then I watched your speech, heard you say that my small act of kindness mattered." His voice grew thick with emotion. "You gave me back my purpose, Desta. You reminded me why I chose this path." The simplicity of his gratitude touched her deeply. In that moment, Desta understood that their connection transcended the textbook that had brought them together. They were linked by something more profound, a shared belief in the power of knowledge to heal, to transform, to create ripples of change that extended far beyond their individual lives. Outside the cafe, they exchanged phone numbers and email addresses, promising to meet again soon to discuss their potential collaboration. As they prepared to part ways, Desta impulsively reached out and took Michael's hand. "In my village," she said softly, "there is a saying, knowledge shared becomes wisdom. Thank you for sharing your knowledge with a girl you never knew." Michael's fingers tightened around hers. "And thank you for transforming that knowledge into hope for countless others." They stood there for a moment longer, connected by touch and by the invisible threads of their intertwined journeys. A broke student and a village girl, a doctor and a scientist, two people who had found each other across time and distance through the simple, profound act of sharing knowledge. As they finally turned to go their separate ways, Michael to his hospital rounds, Desta to her laboratory, both carried with them the certainty that this was not an ending, but a beginning. Their story, which had started with a textbook donated out of both necessity and generosity, was about to enter a new chapter, one they would write together, one molecule, one patient, one discovery at a time. 3 years later, a small clinic opened in Abinet, Ethiopia, not far from the village school where Desta had first encountered Michael's textbook. The sign above the door read Chen Haile Medical Research Center, and beneath it, in smaller letters, knowledge shared becomes wisdom. Inside, children with previously untreatable conditions received innovative therapies developed through the collaboration of a pediatric oncologist and a Nobel Prize-winning biochemist who had discovered each other through an act of kindness made many years before. And in the center's small library, displayed in a glass case for all to see, was a worn biochemistry textbook, its margins filled with notes that had sparked a revolution, not just in science, but in the understanding that the smallest acts of generosity can yield the greatest transformations. Sometimes visitors to the clinic would notice Dr. Chen and Dr. Porinetifornum Shermanenon Hortum, highly standing before this display, their heads bent close together, speaking in the shared language of science and compassion that had brought them full circle, from strangers connected by a textbook to partners united in purpose. Knowledge once set in motion finds its own way forward. And kindness, even when given without expectation of return, has a way of completing the circle.